It's great to welcome to the program today Benjamin Studebaker, who is a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, also the author of a very interesting article. I don't remember how I found recently, but I did find it, called The Decline and Fall of Elizabeth Warren, which I read, I think, while on the treadmill at my gym, Benjamin. And even in that circumstance, it still fully captivated my attention. I was able to stay on the treadmill, fortunately. So let's talk about. I think the context now, of course, to think about Elizabeth Warren is in the context of the 2020 primary and her declaration that she is. I guess it's not yet a formal announcement, but she's going to be exploring, and every indication is that she is indeed running. When you talk about her decline and fall, are we talking about politics? Are we talking about electability? Are we talking about the DNA fiasco? What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think in about 2014, Elizabeth Warren was seen as the leader of the left faction of the Democratic Party and as the only person who was even vaguely left wing who might get any kind of political traction in American politics. And I think that that began to shift going into 2015 when she declined to challenge Hillary Clinton, then when she declined to endorse Bernie Sanders before the Massachusetts primary, and then when she kind of got outflanked on a number of policy areas by Bernie Sanders over the preceding couple of years. And I think she's had a hard time regaining her standing with the left of the party, which has now moved a bit to the left of where she was at.
Yeah, I actually got a phone call from an audience member last week saying, why do I think that there are some so-called progressives within the Democratic Party that are sort of shunning Elizabeth Warren? And I think some of the things you mentioned are definitely factors. The non-endorsement of Bernie Sanders during the primary is something people are talking about. The possible kind of tactical mistake around the DNA test keeps coming up, and I'm glad to sort of hear your thoughts about whether you think that that's a factor. But in the end, I mean, she does have this sort of admittedly kind of amorphous credential as the second most progressive senator in the Senate right now. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau accomplishment is one that I think, in the context of vulture capitalism and everything that the left is learning about our economic system, I think that that is also a strong credential. And I actually think that the fact that she has not adopted the term democratic socialist, I consider that a good thing, because there are some Democrats who have incorrectly adopted that term without seemingly understanding that they're actually social democrats, not democratic socialists. So I think that some of the points you make are good, but I question whether some of them are actually features rather than bugs.
Mm. So I think that one of the things I've noticed with her is that she, for instance, on healthcare, initially before Obama became president, she had healthcare proposals that were not as far left as the ACA.
Hmm.
And then after the ACA came in, then she came up with proposals that were a little bit to the left of where the ACA was. And then Bernie Sanders came out with Medicare for All. And then she responded to that by saying that she was for Medicare for All. And then she started putting out white papers for stuff that's ACA plus a little extra. And she's released a white paper for ACA plus a little extra after having come out for Medicare for All.
Right. Well, okay, I'm glad you bring that up, because we've been talking more and more about, is Medicare for All the new litmus test for 2020? And my prediction has been, and it's starting to sort of be borne out, that in some general sense, it is a litmus test where you're going to have to say, I believe Medicare for All or something like it is the end goal to which we should aspire. But that you're going to see some Democrats kind of playing coy with it by saying, yeah, I think that that is the end point, but here's what I would actually propose doing in the interim. And they'll probably cite a sort of pragmatic justification for that. That's what you're saying Elizabeth Warren is doing, it sounds like.
Yeah, and so she'll position herself often as having the same end policy goals, but her substantive proposals won't be as radical. For instance, she tends to be for debt forgiveness on the student debt issue rather than tuition-free college.
Yes.
So I think those are things that if you're a hardcore Bernie-crat from 2016, you're looking at that and going, that isn't maybe quite as radical as I would like to see. And then I think that you also have this issue that, and I want to get to the Native American thing in a
Yeah.
second, but you also have this issue where there's a perception that I think that she isn't willing to fight for the left in the party and that she wants to work with the party where it is rather than make the party into something different. So whereas Bernie Sanders seems to think it's important to challenge Democratic centrists with progressive or left-wing primary opponents and try to beat them in primaries, Elizabeth Warren, because she didn't run against Hillary Clinton, and because she didn't endorse Sanders during the campaign, and because she doesn't have the same traction with the under 30s, doesn't seem like the kind of person who can lead a prolonged campaign within the party to move the party to the left. And if you think that a lot of these policy proposals are policy proposals that many Democrats are not currently willing to support, the question is, how will we get Democrats who are willing to support that? And I don't think it's a given that those Democrats will support it if you get a progressive who's elected president, in much the same way that it hasn't been a given that Republicans would support repealing and replacing Obamacare simply because Donald Trump is president. Many of them said over and over that they supported those things, and then when he became president, they bailed on him.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of seems like maybe I'm overly pragmatic, but the way I've described it before is that Bernie Sanders, deep down historically, like going back to the 70s, kind of came out of the hipster hippie at the time, I guess, actually close to socialist movement, and has moved to the right in terms of what his publicly stated proposals are. Elizabeth Warren, on the other hand, came from the more regulated capitalist law professor, more sort of establishment point, and moved to the left, as you're describing and as I've described, to end up somewhere that's slightly to the right of Bernie. But I still, in my mind, believe that if Bernie runs, I'm probably supporting Bernie. But if Elizabeth Warren were to defeat him, I find it to be a pretty okay compromise, and I would not have a problem supporting her. I think that they come from different places, but they've ended up in relatively similar positions on a lot of issues, although admittedly couched in very different economic ideas.
Mm. I think from a policy standpoint, they're both trying to take relatively similar policy positions, but where I would really differentiate them is in their attitude and approach to our institutions.
Yes.
I think for Bernie Sanders, the Democratic Party is not in an okay place. It's not currently a party which can advance the set of policies that he wants to see. And so for Bernie, it's not just a matter of being for these policies, it's also for changing and reforming the Democratic Party into the kind of institution that can effectively pursue them. Whereas I think Elizabeth Warren's strategy has been to work with the center of the party pragmatically to try to find compromises that the center of the party can live with. The question is, will the center of the party ever support the more radical stuff?
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that. And I think that in the idea of it's the difference between upending the systems versus improving them slightly is the way I think we would kind of sum it up. Let's talk about the DNA thing. So do you think that in terms of a 2020 candidacy, the release of Elizabeth Warren's DNA results related to her purported Native American ancestry are a liability? Is it a non-factor? Does it help?
So I think it's a liability. The question is precisely what kind. So I think the incident in itself isn't so bad. It has two negative features. One is that Native Americans, of course, don't believe that you can claim Native American identity on the basis of blood or ethnicity. They don't have that kind of self-concept. For them, you have to have tribal citizenship or identity. And so it's a political status identity rather than an ethno-identity. So they're upset about that, and people who sympathize with them will be upset about that. On the other side, Trump, of course, will make a lot of hay out of it and has already used it to make those memes where it's Elizabeth Warren won 2020th instead of 2020. He's going to do that anyway. But what I think is more concerning than those immediate optical issues is what it says about her judgment in a campaign in terms of how she would respond to Trump's attacks. I think that she's someone that I've observed over the last 2 years takes his bait and gives him the kind of response that he wants more than other Democrats. And I remember seeing her respond to one of his Pocahontas taunts with a tweet storm that was 15 tweets long, and any one of those tweets might have been fine in a vacuum, but to have 15 tweets in 15 minutes, that's the kind of response where if I'm online and I see someone do that, I go, oh, that guy got to that person.
Yeah, I mean, I've made it a goal to, at least at this early stage of the primary, not play what I call electability games, which include sort of assessments of what might happen if Trump tweets about this person, what might happen if they get on a general election debate stage. Because I think that if we learned anything from the Republican primary in 2016, it's that playing the electability games and the hypothetical games, rather than just focusing on whose politics do I agree with most, is not a great strategy for Democrats, but it's very hard to deny that she does not seem particularly adept at handling the types of attacks you're talking about. It's very hard for me to make a strong case against that.
Yeah, and I don't think that people should be picking candidates solely on the basis of electability. But I think that if we can find someone who seems to be able to handle the day-to-day punches in a way that is clever and has a substantive politics that's interesting and persuasive and exciting, that would be a good thing.
So, of the people who have announced so far, who do you think that is?
Ooh, I have a lot of doubts about a lot of the people running, and it's difficult because, and it's sort of unfair because each one of these people to move up in the Democratic Party had to come up at a time when the Democratic Party was increasingly dependent on banks for money, and when it was increasingly committed to tough on crime posturing. And because of this, it's hard for people who came up in the 90s in that Generation X to have consistently throughout their careers demonstrated a politics that I can have full confidence in. But I know that some of those people were doing that for political reasons, and some of them were doing it because they really believed in it. And it's very hard to differentiate who is who.
Simply in terms of so now we're going fully into how they would handle a race against Trump and not into policy at all, to be very clear. Of people who have announced and who might announce, I mean, who strikes you as the person that would be most sort of temperamentally fit and have the type of talent that is required to refute the dynamic that Donald Trump creates with the nicknames and the attacks on physical appearance and all of that stuff?
I think the unfortunate answer to that, and it gives me no pleasure to say this, is that the white male candidates are harder for him to pick on in the way that he conventionally picks on people.
Mm.
And particularly people who are of his generation and close to him in age.
So now, interesting, the question is, obviously Biden would be one of those people. Is
Yes.
Bernie one of those people? I mean, because he seems to have done okay with the attacks on Bernie. Bernie, of course, as a Jewish man, is in a sense, of course, he is white. In another sense, he's also not white. So where does that figure in?
Yeah, Bernie, I think it is interesting because Bernie's entire style is to constantly return to issues and constantly talk issues over and over again. When you go to a Bernie stump speech, he says, this is a terrible problem in the country, and here's the thing we need to do. And he does that for every issue, one after another after another. So I think that it would be difficult because I don't see Bernie Sanders being willing to engage Trump in his style, talk about the personal, and talk about himself. And I think that might, to some degree, blunt Trump's attacks, but also it would be a kind of refusal to engage in the banter, rather than
it's
an effective
unclear whether
engagement in the
that would
banter.
be a plus or a minus in a general election campaign. But I guess Bernie hasn't even announced yet, so maybe it's a question we can kind of consider at some point in the future. We've been speaking with Benjamin Studebaker, PhD student at the University of Cambridge, also author of the article, The Decline and Fall of Elizabeth Warren, which we will link to from our YouTube channel. Ben, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.